Okay, so as I said, now I'm going to go over Lass's proposed etymology for it. So, as I said, the Oxford English Dictionary even points us to this now and suggests this is something to do more reading on if you're interested. Lass begins by saying, okay, well, let's consider possible cognates that other scholars have pointed to. So we've got fiken right here, which we've looked at before. We've got folken that we looked at before. We've got folk, which we saw, and folka, and we've got fuka, and that's all of the ones that we looked at so far. Oh wait, there is one other that we talked about, and that's this one here. So those are ones that the Oxford English Dictionary mentions as possible cognates. But there are others, so there's folkhengst as well, folkve, breeding cattle, so stallion breeding cattle, folkerie, folker. So notice that in Dutch, these seem to be especially related to breeding livestock. All right, well, fair enough. I mean, that's not too much of a stretch to see that a word related to sex should, perhaps become specified to livestock sex. Now, here are some that Lass says don't make any sense when we really push them. So he mentions foutre and futere, which both come from Latin future, which all mean basically to fuck. Fair enough, the same meaning, so it looks pretty good. You've got the fa-u in all of these, or fa-o. That looks pretty good as well. And then you've got a T. Okay, well, maybe a K could become a T. You'd have to explain that somehow. But Lass says we can dismiss these out of hand, that these cannot possibly be related to fuck, nor can frongo or frico. None of those really can be related to fuck. We'll have to see exactly why in a moment. But Lass says these, pugnus, pungere, pugno, and pungo, probably are related. So, what gives? Well, we'll try to explain that. Then he also says that this German fichte may very well be related, as is Lithuanian pushis. Now that seems weird, right? So the form doesn't look quite right. You've got a ch there and an e there. You've got a p here. You've got a sh here. And the meaning doesn't look right. Spruce. So obviously he's got some explaining to do. I should have mentioned fuka as well. We did talk about that one. And then there's Greek buttocks as well, which he suggests may very well be related. Let me clear all of the writing I just did and then go to the next slide, where we're going to try to explain why Lass rules out those future examples. So foutre in French, fautere in Italian. Why don't those make sense? Even though they mean fuck, why can't they be related to fuck? Why can't they be cognates? Well, it has to do with an observation that we've got. And this is actually called Grimm's Law. And it comes from Jakob Grimm, who was one of the Grimm brothers who gave us those great fairy tales. Now, Jakob's real passion was for language, and actually his gathering of those folk tales was largely because he was just interested in getting people to talk. And so he started collecting people and realized that he could get people to speak German to him. You know, he would travel around the German countryside which really wasn't a country at the time that he was doing this. It was more of a just a series of fiefdoms. And so he would go to these places and he would ask people to speak German so that he could see how the different dialects of German were related. And he got some really good stories, and he and his brother published them. But what he was really interested in was German. And then he realized that he could demonstrate that German and Latin and Greek and a lot of other languages are related in a very systematic way. And he was able to show that they are sister languages that all descend from this common ancestor language that we call Proto-Indo-European. And so part of this was to demonstrate that there were regular sound changes that we can observe, where we can look at Germanic words and Latin words and Greek words and see that they all have sort of similar meanings, but that they differ in systematic ways. And this particular sound change that we're going to see here is called Grimm's Law. What we see is that in all of these, and I'm using English as a representation for Germanic languages, but it could be any Germanic language really. And what we're seeing then is that we've got these words father, ford, thirst, thunder, horn, and heart, all of which have a very similar word in Latin, except for the first sound actually looks significantly different. So you've got father and pater, ford and portus, us we can pretty much ignore, thirst and torere, thunder and tonare, horn and corn, heart and cord. And you can see, these English words that kind of show you the Latin words. Whoops. Sorry about that. So, what Grimm observed is that in English you have these what are called fricative sounds, where you've got these sounds where the air flows freely. And they're kind of soft sounds, like th, th, h. Whereas in Latin, there are these hard, what are called stops. P, t, k. So you've got a p and a f, p and a f, t and a th, t and a th, k and a h, k and a h. Very systematic. We find this in word after word, comparing Germanic languages and Latin. And so what he realized was that there must have been this common ancestor language that had a sound that became one thing in Latin and another thing in English. And so what he discovered was that this sound p became th in all of the Germanic languages. The t sound became th, and so on. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that if fuck really does date back to Proto-Indo-European, then what was the first sound in Latin? P. It had to be P, which means that if we look at Latin languages, Romance languages like French, Italian, and Latin, then we can rule out anything that begins with a f. So fut, fotere, future, frango, frico, all of those can be ruled out because the ones that we're really interested in have to start with a p, which is why pugnus actually makes more sense than future. All right. So we can now then start thinking about our Indo-European families. So we've got this language, Proto-Indo-European, that was spoken around 3500 BC, let's say. And it gave birth to all of these other languages. So basically, there was this nomadic tribe that spoke a language, Proto-Indo-European. They lived probably in and around the Caucasus Mountain, the Caucasus Mountains in Asia. And then as they started spreading out and different segments of this tribe started going in different directions, the language started changing over time, so that after a couple thousand years, you've got a whole bunch of completely independent languages that all descended from the same common ancestor language. So you've got the Indian languages, the Indian language family that gave birth to modern Hindu and Urdu. Then you've got Iranian languages that give birth to Persian and Dari, which is spoken in Afghanistan. Germanic languages, which we'll come back to in a second, the Balto-Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian, Lithuanian. Then you've also got Celtic languages, Hellenic, i.e. Greek, and then the Latin or Italic languages, right? So you've got all of these Romance languages down here. You've got the Slavic languages here. You've got the Iranian languages here, and the Indian languages over here. And then you've got this Germanic family, which starts with Proto-Germanic and then descends down to the North Germanic family, which includes Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, and Icelandic. And then you've got the West Germanic family that includes modern German, Yiddish, and then also modern English, of course, and Dutch over here. All right, so we've got these languages, and we can see then how they are related, like a family tree, is the idea here. And that's why we look to languages like Dutch for our first cognates. And then we look beyond Dutch to German, and then we look beyond German to Norwegian and Swedish, and we try to trace it back to Proto-Germanic. So that would be our first step. And then if we can trace it back to Proto-Germanic, then hopefully we can trace it back even further by comparing it to these other language families. And so that's why then we go to Romance languages, Greek, maybe even Celtic languages if we could, Slavic languages, until ultimately we can trace it all the way back to Indo-European. So it's this kind of piecemeal process where we try to bring it back further and further with each step by comparing languages and making, hypotheses all the way. So, what Lass says in the end here, and this is going to be confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it as I go through this. So, he's saying Middle English, that ME means Middle English. The star here means that it's a reconstructed form. So as we saw, the earliest representation is from the 15th century in writing. So we don't have any examples from Middle English per se, but we can make a pretty good hypothesis that it would have been Fuken originally, that it probably came from a Germanic root, Fuk, and possibly an Indo-European root, Bug. And so obviously, as soon as we get back to Proto-Germanic, then we have to put that little asterisk there, because clearly that has to be reconstructed. There's no writing from Proto-Germanic, and there's certainly no writing from Indo-European. So we can find Bug is what he's suggesting was the original root, and he's saying that it meant something like to stab or to prick. And then he says maybe it was related, that it was contaminated by this word pog, which meant something like compress or to join, and that might explain why the Oxford English Dictionary suggests strike. Maybe there was some similarity between the bug and the pog, that people saw them as related words. And then he says cognate to Dutch foken, German fiken, Icelandic fuke, Latin pugno, bungo, and more distantly related to the Greek pugu, buttocks, and Latin bongo, to drive in. He suggests that maybe this was, again, contaminated by some other words. And then Germanic fichte and pushis. Now, to understand this, what he's getting at is that you've got this word in Latin, bungo, which he thinks is probably pretty close to the bug in Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, and that n was probably inserted in there, contaminated by some other word, that n wasn't original to it. And then the pugno was probably sort of a related meaning that diverged off of sting, and then you got the meaning of strike, something like that, and then again possibly because of the compress here. Now, he's also suggesting that at some point in Germanic, in Proto-Germanic, we probably started associating it with sex to some degree. And that's why we find it in all of these different languages like Swedish and Dutch and German being related to sex. And there you've got a pretty clear metaphor, right? Where sting, right, so something gets inserted into the skin. All right, it's not hard to see how that could be a metaphor for sex. All right, so that part all makes sense. The last one that we've got to explain is why the heck is he saying Fichte and Puschis, both of which mean spruce, might be related to modern English fuck? Well, what he's saying here is that spruce actually helps us with this original meaning of to stab or to prick. So for those of you who've spent any time in a forest and you learn to identify a spruce tree, and I remember this quite vividly. A friend of my father's, who knew quite a bit about forest botany, he was the first to explain this to me, that if you ever want to identify a spruce tree, if you want to know for sure if it's a spruce tree, just touch the needles. If they prick your finger, it's a spruce tree. So basically, in two independent languages here, both of them related to true Proto-Indo-European, but both of them separated by millennia of thousands of years, 1,000 years at least, that both of them called spruce trees a word related to this word meaning stab or to prick, because these are trees that prick. All right, so that's the etymology. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the best etymology that we've got, the best hypothesis that we've got, until somebody comes up with a better hypothesis, one that has even more evidence to support it. This is the hypothesis that I would stand by. I don't know as much about the one the Oxford English Dictionary gives about strike. It's a possibility. It seems kind of similar to what Lass is proposing here. But I find Lass's etymology to be compelling, at least. And, and he certainly provides a lot of evidence to support it.